Okay, so we are recording on the Web Yeshiva system, and that will suffice for now. And then later we'll have to upload it to Facebook, which is what we normally do live. So apologies to those who were trying to get onto the Facebook Web Yeshiva page, but you'll have to watch it later. Okay, hello everybody. And after a long absence because of the holidays, because of the Chagim, we are back and we are entering into the concluding chapters of Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. This is Daniel Karapkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario at the Bayit for webyeshiva.org. And we've been studying Moreh Nevukhim, the Rambam's Guide for the Perplexed, for quite some time now, for several years, and we're getting into the final chapters. We're going to start chapter 51 today, and what I'd like to do is spend a little bit of extra time on these final four chapters, 51, 52, 53, and 54, because I think that in many ways they contain, by the Rambam's own admission, a recap and a tamtzit, sort of an extraction of what he was trying to communicate for all of these throughout the Sefer, throughout all three sections of the guide. The Rambam's trying to tie them all together and give us sort of his sof davar hakol nishma, at the end of everything. What's the bottom line? So that's what I really think that the purpose of these chapters is. And I hope, therefore, that we'll be able to spend a little bit more time. My goal is, and you'll see why that is shortly, that we're going to divide chapter 51 into three different parts. So three different classes on chapter 51, and then we'll take it from there. I'm going to share my screen now, which gives you a breakdown of the first part of chapter 51 in section 3 of the guide. And we've titled this shiur for today, A Summation with No New Information, which is what the Rambam says this chapter is about, and the 7 levels of man that the Rambam will provide for us in this chapter. Now, in the previous chapter, the Rambam had concluded his exposition on the Torah, the reasons for its commandments, for its mitzvot, ta'amei ha-mitzvot, and the significance of the non-mitzvah portions of the Torah, the narratives, the stories, the chronicles, and so forth. That was what we saw in chapter 50. He now embarks in these final chapters with a summation of the entire treatise. And therefore, the Rambam begins by saying that this chapter does not contain any new material, but is rather a kind of conclusion, which I will explain. The Rambam says that this chapter, this is not always what the Rambam does at the beginning of a chapter, but at the beginning of this chapter, he basically tells us that there are 3 topics that I'm going to be covering in this chapter. Number 1, the proper worship of God for someone who properly understands God. Now, it's a very interesting way for the Rambam to phrase this, but as we're going to see, the Rambam suggests that the purpose of the guide is that we should properly be able to understand who God is to the best extent possible for any human being to understand God. No one can fully plumb the depths of an understanding of God, but at least we can understand God and metaphysics, the machinations of the realm from God's perspective, of all of that exists, to some degree. And once you've reached that level of understanding, there's a mode of worship which is appropriate for that individual. And so I'm going to lay out what that mode of worship is. And then the Rambam says, the second part of this chapter is how to arrive at that level of proper worship. What does a person need to do to be able to get to that lofty level of being able to worship God properly after having properly apprehended him? And number 3, how divine providence is at its peak when someone has reached this level until his death. And that's a sort of a sidebar, really not related to divine worship directly, but as we'll see when we get towards the end of this chapter, the Rambam feels that it's important to underscore how a person can avoid many of the misfortunes of life by being privy to what's called hashgacha pratit, to divine intervention at every juncture of his life, provided that he is fulfilling this type of divine worship that the Rambam is going to be detailing in this chapter. So those are the three sections of this chapter. Number one, what is the proper worship for someone who has reached the lofty level of understanding God? Number two, how to reach that level. And number three, how divine providence, how God's oversight of a person's life is enhanced because of the fact that they have reached that lofty level. So we're going to discuss the first part of this chapter today. To explain what proper worship is, we start with a parable of the Rambam's own design. And in this chapter, the Rambam makes a special point of saying that I've made up this parable. And I think what he's trying to signal to us is that up until now in the guide, the Rambam has mostly provided us with information that is either based upon the words of Tanakh, the words of the Bible, or the words of the sages, or the words of his philosophical forebears, primarily Aristotle and the Islamic heirs to Aristotle. But now he says, this is something original. And I want you to know that you're not going to, if you try to source this in the words of our sages, you're not likely to find it. That there are 7 levels of human beings that I can describe in the following parable. So this is my parable, says the Rambam, and the parable describes a king who dwells within his palace in the capital city. The 7 levels of human beings are represented in this parable by the subjects of the king who live in this country. So the lowest level are those of the king's subjects who are completely outside the city, the furthest away from the king. And apparently they have no desire to access the city to be able to find the king's palace. And that's the lowest level of humanity, and we'll explain all of these momentarily. Level number 2 is some of the king's subjects are in the city, but they have their backs to the king's palace. Imagine going into the city, the capital city where the king's palace is, but instead of turning towards this beautiful edifice, you instead occupy yourself at the capital's bazaar or marketplace and have your back to the king's palace. Level number 3, some subjects seek the king's palace and to stand before him, but because of their ignorance, they have not yet even seen the palace walls. So there are people who actually come to the capital city. They want to come to see where the king lives, but they don't have proper directions. So they haven't yet even seen the palace walls. Level number 4, some subjects have reached the palace, but walk around it, searching for the entrance gate, which they have not yet found. Level number 5, some subjects have entered the palace gate, so they've been able to find the entrance to the palace walls. But then once inside this huge edifice, they walk around in the antechambers, in the outside rooms, the study and the dining room, and all of the rooms where the king is not to be found. But they're looking for the king's chamber. They're trying to find where the king resides. Level number 6, some subjects have actually reached the inner sanctum of the king. They know exactly where to find the king. They are successfully reach the king's royal office, and they are even in the same room as the king. However, they don't see the king. They can't find the king there, even though he may be right there. They don't see, hear, or speak with the king. And then we get to the highest level within this parable, that these subjects are in the king's presence and either A, see him from afar, B, see him from up close, hear the king speaking, or D, actually speak directly with the king. So we have our 7 levels. Now let's explain the meaning of the parable of these different levels of subjects of the king who either are completely disinterested or are assiduously working towards accessing the king. The meaning of the parable is at level number 1. The people outside the city refers to those people who have no doctrinal belief whatsoever, neither based on speculation nor on tradition. And we'll notice that the Rambam uses this speculation versus tradition dichotomy in a couple of places in this chapter. In other words, there are many people who might have some kind of religious belief, but that is not arrived at based on deep speculation, but is only arrived at based upon what has been taught to them, passed down to them by their religious teachers and forebears. Other people arrive at religious ideologies based upon speculation, based upon deeply contemplating the ultimate truths of reality and coming to their own conclusions. But this level of people, the people who are compared to those who are completely outside the city, have no ideological belief whatsoever. They're completely secular, have no ideology whatsoever. This level includes the furthest most Turks in the north, the furthermost Kushites in the south, and those who are even in temperate climates, such as ours, who are like them. Now, it's almost as if the Rambam is signaling something that Rebbe Yehuda Halevi also talks about, which was a common belief in the medieval period, that a person is a product of the climate in which he lives. If you live far to the north, where it gets very cold and chilly, like up here in Canada, you might have a compromised intellect because of the great cold that prevents you or stifles you from becoming passionate and pensive in deep thought. If you live in the deep south, like in Africa, where it's really, really hot, that could also inhibit your intellect in some way, making you extremely heated emotionally, and also inhibit the cool intellectual pursuits of a true philosopher. So the Rambam says it could be that there are Turks to the north and Kushites to the south in Africa who have no ideology, and that could, perhaps he's signaling to us that that could be a product of their climate. But he says, but there are also people who live in temperate climates who also lack any sense of ideological belief. So the problem is that if you're a human being and you don't exercise your intellect, which is as the Rambam had said at the very first chapter of the guide, that is the unique feature of what it means to be a human being. It is what distinguishes a human being from animals. He says, if you don't exercise that mental faculty, then you are no different from an animal because you have not yet accessed the thing which makes you uniquely human. And just to quote, he says, to my mind, they do not have the rank of men. Instead, they occupy a rank lower than humans, but higher than apes. So these are the lowest of people because they're not interested in pursuing any kind of knowledge of divinity, any kind of religious belief, nothing. Level number 2, the people who are within the city but have their backs turned to the palace refers to those who have false ideologies. So a person may be a Christian, may be a Muslim, may be a Zoroastrian, may be a complete pagan idolater, and a Hindu, a Buddhist, or whatever it is. These people have ideologies, but there's something problematic with these ideologies, either because of faulty speculation, because they've arrived at what they consider to be true using faulty logic, or a tradition that is faulty. They've received a religious tradition that is faulty, that gives them information that is erroneous. And the Rambam writes that these people are far worse than the first level, since they can potentially lead others astray. And that is why, the Rambam writes, that it is sometimes justifiable to kill these people and eradicate their ideologies. This is a very dramatic statement for the Rambam to make. I'm not aware of other places where the Rambam advocates violence against people who have false ideologies. But I guess what he's trying to do is, I think he's hearkening back to the Torah's command that when you encounter idolatry in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, once you, the Jewish nation, have taken possession of the land, you have to completely eradicate any false ideology. And so the Rambam is simply saying that when we look at the Torah and try to find the reason why the Torah can sanction violent extermination of human beings because of the ideologies that they harbor, it boils down to this. These people are extremely corrosive to the rest of humanity, and therefore we have to eradicate them by any means necessary. And that's what the Rambam suggests is what the Torah's advocacy for this kind of violent behavior is. Obviously, it's not something that he himself would have advocated to be put into practice in his times. We know historically that that was not the way that Jews were ever since even from the Second Temple period. So it's not something that he's practically advocating, but he's sort of explaining why such a thing could be justifiable. What's interesting is that he's suggesting that the people on level 2 who do have an ideology but a false one are actually worse than the people who are on level 1. And that's what the Rambam writes. He says these people are far worse because they're going to have a corrosive effect on the rest of humanity. What struck me is that these are the people in the parable who have entered the city, but they have their backs to the king. And it's interesting, there's a halacha in the Shulchan Aruch about Birkat Kohanim, about the priestly blessing. We know that in Israel today, Jews receive the priestly blessing on a daily basis from the Kohanim. The Talmud says that the Am Sheba Sadot, that the people who are unable to come to synagogue on a daily basis because they are forced to work out in the fields and they cannot access the synagogue and also work the fields at the same time, they receive the priestly blessing. But if a person were to come into the synagogue and turn his back to the Kohanim while they are offering the priestly blessing, that is a blatant demonstration of the fact that they are rejecting the priestly blessing, and therefore the priestly blessing does not fall upon them. They do not receive the benefits of the priestly blessing. This is actually codified in Shulchan Aruch, and it just struck me that perhaps that's the reason why the Rambam chooses this analogy of this level of people with false ideologies enter into the capital city, but turn their back towards the palace because they have no interest because of their false ideology. And they provide a corrosive effect for the onlooker. Level number 3, those who seek the king but haven't seen the palace walls. That refers to the multitude who follow the Torah and its laws, but do so in a state of ignorance, what the Rambam calls Amei Haaretz, who fulfill the mitzvot. Now, this is really, really important for us to take a moment and absorb this. The Rambam is saying that if a Yid, a Jew, has what we call emunah pshuta, simple faith, I believe in God, I'm not interested in philosophy, I'm not interested in deep speculation, but ich bin a Yid, and I love God, and I love the Torah, and I danced with the Torah on Simchas Torah, and I receive the Torah on Shavuot, and I enjoy, and I go to shul every Shabbos, and I have Kiddush, and I dance, and I sing, and I feel good at my Shabbos table, and I love being a Jew, and I fulfill the mitzvot very meticulously. That person is only at the next level. He is only at level 3 out of 7. The Rambam does not have great regard for those kinds of people because, once again, they have disregarded the primary ingredient of what it means to be a human being, which is to exercise one's intellect, the tselem and dumut elokim that God imbued within man, to enable man to access God. You may think that you love God. You may think that you have this immense, tremendous faith in God, but you don't have a clue about what it means to have a relationship with God if you have never used your intellect in order to speculate about the existence of all that is, about reality, and all of the deeper aspects of existence. So let's keep that in mind. Obviously, this is a very intellectually based work. The Rambam is extremely intellectually based and therefore has little regard for those who do not exercise their intellect. We've seen this multiple times throughout the guide. but it's sort of very much in our faces in this chapter. Level number 4, those who have found the palace but walk around it in search of the gate. They see the palace, they see the walls of the palace, but they haven't been able to find the doorway to get in. That refers to Torah scholars who have received a tradition of correct ideas. They have what's called a misorah. They study halacha. They are experts at the knowledge of Jewish law and of the performance of the mitzvot. But they do not engage in any kind of speculation concerning the foundations of our faith. And that, the Rambam says, a person could be a Rosh Yeshiva. A person could have a very long beard and be extremely knowledgeable of halachic matters, but he has not engaged in speculation concerning the reasons why we believe the things that we believe. He has not yet engaged in deep speculation about the basis of our engagement with God and why we receive the Torah and what the basis of our acceptance of the Torah is. Such a person may be very pious in his behavior, may be very learned in areas of Torah law, but is still only on level number 4. Level number 5 are those who have entered the antechambers of the palace, the rooms where the king is not to be found, but at least they've gotten into the palace and are walking around. Refers to those who have plunged into speculation about the foundations of faith, what the Rambam had previously called in previous chapters the Pardes. They have entered into philosophical speculation about reality, about existence, and about God. Now, obviously, there are multiple levels within this category, says the Rambam, but that's a higher level than even the great rabbis who are experts in Jewish law, are the people who, both Jew and non-Jew presumably, who have engaged in this deep speculation of existence. Level number 6, those who have entered the king's inner sanctum but have not yet had a chance to actually interact or even see the king, refers to those who have achieved clarity and near certainty to whatever extent possible on these matters of speculation, and especially matters concerning God. So level number 5 are those who are engaging in speculation, but may not have yet arrived at complete clarity, and certainly have not yet arrived on clarity about God's existence. But level number 6, the people who have reached the inner sanctum of the king, are those who have actually reached a certain clarity on the existence of God and his nature and the nature of all of existence. Now we'll get to level number 7 in a moment, but first the Rambam takes a short interlude. And he says, clarifying others who are part of these levels. And that's what the Rambam wants to do now. He says, I want to make sure you understand what level 4, 5, and 6 really are. If you are engaged in studying mathematics and logic, you are like those who walk around the palace in search of the gate. That is level number 4. And the Rambam makes a very bold statement here. He says that people, even if they're completely secular, non-sectarian, not religious, not Jewish at all, but they engage in the study of mathematics and logic, which is the entree, the gateway to a proper ability to enter into speculation about reality. So you're on level number 4. You found the palace, but you walk around it in search of the gate. And how do we know this? He says this is evidenced by one of our sages named Ben Zoma. And the Gemara tells us that Ben Zoma was once staring into space while that was standing on the Temple Mount. And Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hanania notices that Ben Zoma is staring into space, and he asks him, Me'ayin ula'ayin Ben Zoma, what are you thinking about, Ben Zoma? What are you meditating about? And Ben Zoma says, I was doing calculations in my mind. At least this is the way the Rambam is reading this Gemara. And based on my calculations, there is only the distance of 3 finger breadths between the upper waters and the lower waters. So clearly Ben Zoma was trying to contemplate reality, but he was doing so based purely on logic and mathematics. That's the way the Rambam understands that Talmudic narrative. And his conclusion was, of Rabbi Yehoshua, was, and he's told this to his students, Adayin ben Zoma mibachutz. Ben Zoma is still on the outside. He's outside the palace. In other words, he's still in search of the truth because he's only started on this course. And so that's the way the Rambam understands that if a person is studying mathematics and logic, which are the tools necessary to arrive at certain truths, but hasn't yet really engaged in the deeper speculation, you're just on level number 4. Now, the Rambam is equating such a person who engages in these secular endeavors as being on the same level as Torah scholars who spend their day studying halakha. So the Shem Tov Falaquera commentary is truly bothered by this, and he expounds on the different levels of Torah scholars. But suffice it to say that if a person is a Torah scholar and he engages in speculation, then obviously he's going to be reaching either level 5 or level 6. But we're talking about those Torah scholars who are exclusively dedicated to the study of the law and have not spent any time or very little time on this endeavor that the Rambam feels is where one should really be focusing their primary foci and efforts. It's quite interesting, the phenomenon that we see today, that such an emphasis is placed upon great rabbis and leaders of our generation who are very, very deep thinkers, but strictly in matters of halakha and not on matters of philosophy and speculation on what we would call, let's say, machshevet Israel, Jewish thought about the deeper issues that, let's say, someone like Rav Kook would spend a lot of time on. The Rambam doesn't really have that great regard for them. He says they're doing good things, they're good people, but as far as accessing the highest level of their humanity, they're still stuck sort of on level 4, perhaps level 5. So he says, if, however, you have clarity about matters within nature, then you are at level number 5. So if you just studied mathematics and logic and you're just speculating and extrapolating based on that, you're on level 4. Once you arrive at clarity on matters of nature, then you're at level 5. And if you achieve clarity on divine matters, then you have reached level number 6. And this is the rank of the truly wise, says the Rambam. The true Talmid Chacham is a person who not only has clarity on religious observance, but also has clarity on the purpose of existence, how God interacts with our universe, and so forth. Now, level number 7, however, is the highest level. And those who enter the inner sanctum and engage with the king, now we return to our list, and this is the highest level. This refers to those who, after having attained a full knowledge of divine, of that which is divine, of an understanding of God, turn wholly to God, renounce what is other than he, and direct all the acts of their intellects toward an examination of all beings with the goal of drawing from them proof of God. So a person has reached a certain level of clarity of understanding God. Then what he does after that is he incessantly focuses his attention upon God, upon God's creations, and drawing and inferring from God's world and the things within God's world a greater knowledge of God, so as to know his governance of them in whatever way it is possible. Now, this is very vague, and of course, it's not really, the Rambam doesn't really detail for us. What does that mean? That the true knower of God is able now to go into a garden, lean over, look at a flower, and analyze it on a cellular level, on a molecular level, on an atomic level, and really, really drill deeper and deeper down into the realities of this universe, and then appreciating how God is in control of every single subatomic particle of the flower. I don't know if that's what he means. It could be what he means, but he doesn't provide us any more information about this person other than this person has absolute clarity about God, but that's not enough. Just to have intellectual clarity is not enough. You have to now go to the next step, which is divine worship. And that is to say that you focus all of your attention, all of your waking hours towards thinking about God and finding God in everything that is around you. These people are truly in the king's presence, and this level refers to the prophets. Of course, there are multiple levels, as explained above. Those who see the king from afar, those who see the king up close, those who can actually hear the king speak, and those who actually speak directly with the king. Correspondingly, there are different levels of prophecy. This hopefully should remind you, should jar your memory back to section 2 when the Rambam had an extensive discussion of the prophetic experience and the different levels of prophecy. The highest prophet, he says, was Moshe Rabbeinu, was Moses, who had the highest degree of understanding and who renounced completely everything other than God. Thus he achieved the level of that he was with God, as the Torah states in Exodus chapter 34. He was with God for 40 days and 40 nights. He neither ate bread nor drank water. And the Rambam understands that this is in accord with Moshe's ultimately high level of prophecy. The reason he did not need food or water was because of this natural phenomenon of prophecy, because his intellect had reached such an exalted level that all his other organs and sensory perceptions ceased to function. And a person only needs to sustain their body on a daily basis if they are going to be using their bodily functions. But if a person is so completely overcome by their intellectual faculties, then their body becomes comatose, and a person therefore does not need to sustain the body with either food or water for even 40 days. Now, I don't know whether this is medically accurate or not. I'm just letting you know that the Rambam is explaining this from a scientific standpoint. He is suggesting that it is not a miraculous phenomenon that Moshe was able to subsist for 40 days and 40 nights without food and water, but rather a natural phenomenon of the prophet who was so completely overtaken by his intellect that his body is rendered motionless and useless, and therefore does not need sustenance to sustain the physical part of his being. Lesser prophets, he says, could only see God, some from up close and some from afar, as it says in Jeremiah, Merachok Hashem nir ali, God appeared to me from afar, meaning that he had a minor prophecy. And of course, we've already discussed the different levels of prophecy in section 2 of the guide, particularly in chapter 45, and we refer you to a review of that chapter, wherein the Rambam listed 11 levels of prophecy and differentiated between a prophet who sees versus hears versus dreaming versus seeing God via an angel, seeing God directly, seeing God in a vision, hearing God's voice, etc. All of those were previously discussed. We're not going to go into that today, but suffice it to say that level 7 is the level of the prophet. Now, the Rambam himself will acknowledge later on that he has not reached that level of level number 7, but he's working on it. He's aspiring towards it. We go on. True divine worship must be predicated upon a proper knowledge of all that exists. Engaging in divine speculation without a proper grounding in the sciences, following a mere imagining, or following a belief adopted because of his reliance on the authority of someone else. Basically, if I just think about God based on the Masorah, based on a tradition of what God is that I've learned from somebody else, but not having speculated upon it by myself personally, is, in my opinion, says the Rambam, not really thinking about God. You're not doing anything useful, according to the Rambam. That is because one is merely using his imagination to conjure ideas that have no mooring in reality. And again, this speaks to the Rambam's belief that prophecy is an intellectual endeavor. It's not that someone can be zapped miraculously with a prophetic experience. A person has to work towards achieving prophecy through the attenuation and strengthening of their intellect. We have explained this in our discourse regarding God's attributes. And I'm just quoting the opening of chapter 50. When reading my present treatise, bear in mind that by faith we do not understand merely that which is uttered with the lips, but also that which is apprehended by the soul, the conviction that the object of belief is exactly as it is apprehended. If, as regards real or supposed truths, you content yourself with giving utterance to them in words, I believe Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, without really understanding what Echad means, without really understanding what Hashem it means, without understanding what Shema Yisrael means, without apprehending them or believing in them, especially if you do not seek real truth, you have a very easy task, as in fact you will find many ignorant people professing articles of faith without connecting any idea with them. So the Rambam's already talked about this all the way back in section 1 of the guide, chapter 50. But then the Rambam continues, however, if you have properly engaged in speculation to the point where you properly understand God in his acts, you should devote yourself completely to his worship and strengthen the bond that you have already established, namely through the intellect. So that's part 2 of what a person has to do. He's got to first understand God and all of existence, but that's not enough. You have to take it to the next level, which is to worship God, which is level number 7, focusing every waking moment towards strengthening that understanding and strengthening the bond with God. That intellectual connection is the necessary prerequisite to all of this worship, and that is clear from Scripture. Because first, at the beginning of Deuteronomy, God says, Atah har'eta ladat. God says, I demonstrated all of the experiences that you had in the desert so that you would know, ladat. It further states, V'yadatah, you shall know this day. In other words, the attainment of the knowledge of God is a necessary thing. But then later Scripture says, Le'ahavat Hashem Elokechem ula avdo b'chol levavchem u'b'chol nafshechem, from the Shema, of course, that you have to love God and then to worship him. Love is a necessary prerequisite for worship, and as we've clarified multiple times before, love is proportionate to knowledge. How do I achieve a love of God? By knowing God. The more I know God, the more I love God. The more I love God, in reality, the more I know him. For the Rambam, even love, which is an emotional expression, is a product of the intellect, at least when it pertains to God. Now, you may argue that the Rambam's understanding of love is that your pet dog may love you, but they don't possess an intellect, and therefore their love is merely devotion or is merely a desire to be together with their master. But it's not predicated on any intellectual knowledge of who the master is, other than the person who pets them and feeds them. However, a true love is predicated upon a true knowledge of the object of that love. And the same is true with God. The Rambam had said this multiple times. The most famous one that we've quoted before when we studied chapter 28 of this section is in Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah, chapter 2, halacha 2. He says, V'heichi haderech la'ahavato v'yirato. How does a person arrive at true love and reverence for God? When a person properly contemplates God's deeds and God's creations, and he looks and sees how wondrous they are, he realizes the great wisdom that in the infinite wisdom that went into the creation of all that exists. Miyad hu ohev u'mishabeach u'mifa'er. That causes a person to immediately love and praise and glorify, u'mitzaveh ta'ava gedola leida Hashem hagadol, and fills him with a great yearning, a great desire to know God as much as possible. Okay, and that's what love is. That love of God is a true knowledge of God. So, looking at the verse in Deuteronomy 11, Le'ahavat Hashem Elokechem, if you want to really attain true love of God, the next step that comes after that knowledge of God that leads to love is Ula Avdo, to properly worship him. To what worship do we refer? This is setting one's mind upon God at every opportunity. And that is why our sages call prayer Avodah Shebalev in Tractate Tanit. The rabbis ask the question, when the Torah says to worship God with your heart, what does that mean? Ezuhi avodah shehi balev, heve omer zu tefillah. This is prayer. For the Rambam, prayer cannot be limited to the utterance of words. If a prayer is merely the utterance of words, for the Rambam, it is meaningless. It does not accomplish the objective of prayer, which is to worship God after having attained a knowledge of who he is, and then using one's words to strengthen that bond by praising God, by expressing one's yearnings to be close to God. All of that is the content of prayer, but it has to be a mental engagement. If a person is not mentally engaged during prayer, he's lost the whole purpose of prayer. And we're just going to finish with this. We see that David exhorted his son Solomon to work on these two things. Number one, to first apprehend God properly. And number two, once he properly apprehended God, to worship him, to strengthen that intellectual bond. The verse that the Rambam refers to is from Divrei Hayamim, first Divrei Hayamim, chapter 28, where he says, V'ata Shlomo b'ni. Now, you, my son Solomon, Da et Hashem et Elokei Avicha ve'ovdehu. Know the Lord of your father and worship him. Belev shalem u'benefesh chafetz, with a full heart and a desirous soul. Ki kol levavot doresh Hashem, because all good hearts should seek out God. B'chol yetzer machshavot mevin, because rather God seeks out all hearts. He wants people to seek him out, and he understands everything that is within man's inclination or man's inner thoughts. Im tidrashenu yimatzelach, if you seek him out, you will find him. V'im tazvenu yaznicha chala'ad, and if you forsake God, he shall forsake you forever. Now, this verse is going to be highly relevant for the Rambam's discussion of providence at the end of this chapter. But for our purposes now, David's charge to Solomon to da'et Elokei Avicha, know the God of your father, is to intellectually understand God, not just to imagine God without utilizing logical methodology, since that is not knowledge per se, but rather the ha'oleh al ruchachem, something that just comes to your mind. So when King David told his son Solomon, Da et Elokei Avicha, he was expressing to him this charge that you must use proper philosophical speculation. We thus see that only after apprehending God properly should one go to the next level of worship, that is, the constant employment of intellectual thought in loving him. And how does one accomplish this? In one word, solitude. And that's something that we will expand upon in the next part of this chapter, which we hope to look at next week. Suffice it to say that the way you achieve proper worship of God is by detaching yourself from the physical trappings of this world. And that requires solitude. If a person is constantly going to be bombarded with external stimuli of this world, there is no way that he can arrive at the divine worship that the Rambam is speaking about now. And that's going to be the subject of the next part of our chapter, and it will hopefully help us understand why the Rambam is prepared to acknowledge that he has not yet reached this level because of all of the distractions that are part of his own personal life. So we'll hold it here for today. I did notice that someone had placed a comment. Is there something that anyone would like to mention before we close it? Let's see. Michael says, as you describe it, the Rambam is suggesting that anything less than the highest of levels is meaningless. No, I didn't say that. Anything less than using one's mind is meaningless. Meaning if a person gets stuck on level number 3, he's the Am Haaretz, he's the ignoramus that is not interested in using his intellect, then the Rambam finds this to be not of a very lofty level. He's not as bad as the person without any ideology. He's certainly not as bad as a person who has a false ideology, but because he has not used his intellect properly, he's on a very low level of connection with God. That's a very big chidush, because the Rambam, remembers, an Aristotelian philosopher. For him, a lack of engagement with our intellects to be able to understand God and his universe properly, no matter how pious a person is in their personal observance, the Rambam doesn't have that great regard for that person. That doesn't mean that the Rambam is the final say on this matter, and that's something perhaps that we'll discuss next time. Okay, have a great week, everybody. Hope to see you soon. Take care, everyone.